Appreciate that. As we get started today, I just want to ask you to imagine with me for just a moment that you're in your youth. Now, for some of you in the room, that won't be too hard to do because that's where you're at. For others of us in the room, it may take a moment to think back to being that younger spirit, that younger version of ourselves. But here we are in our youth. We're reading about this promised Messiah who is to come one day, who is to set the captives free, is to release and bring freedom to his people, the restoration of our land, to refuel and to satisfy those who are longing for mercy and justice. And then fast forward. You're sitting here as an adult at the bottom of a mountain, and you're listening to the claims of this one who says that he is that very Messiah, the one that has come to bring hope for all people. And as you're listening that day, he starts by saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. And blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. And blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God." Imagine your excitement as you're hearing these words. Jesus Christ, the Messiah, is speaking. Probably the greatest sermon ever preached, promising great rewards for faith and the demonstration of our faith. Being one who is weary sitting there, who has been ruled over, who feels like a stranger in our own promised land, feel rejected and pushed away. And now this Messiah is inviting us in. He's changing everything. It's rewarding, it's life-changing. The very words he's speaking are giving life to our souls in that moment. And if the 7 things he's already said aren't grand enough, the rewards, which really no other religion has offered, to have mercy, to have peace, to have the ability to see God, to be called sons of God. And so there you are, like a kid at Christmas, saving the biggest gift under the tree. Jesus ends the Beatitudes with a final beatitude. And as we unpack it today, the end of our series, the last beatitude, he says these words in verse 10. He said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Wait, what? I mean, that had to be shocking to these people who were sitting there. The very thing they were expecting and all that they had progressed up this beatitudinal ladder. That was a word made up, by the way. A beatitudinal ladder that we've come to admit our sins. We've given ourselves before God. We've allowed him to enter in. We've wanted mercy and kindness and peace. And we've forbidden all the other things. And these things are hard to accomplish in our lives, as you know. And now as a reward for these things, Jesus says we're going to get persecuted? Well, obviously it needed a lot of explanation back in Jesus' day, as well as it does today. So I would just invite you to put on your seatbelts because we're going to go a little off-road today in some areas of challenge that we always don't pursue. But I know God has this for us today as we unpack and we look at this last beatitude and really the beauty of what it means to be a part of God's kingdom with Jesus as our King. You know, I would love to say, as the sermon began the Beatitudes, it's known as the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I have a little pet peeve here, and I know we all have our pet peeves, but don't ask my wife about all my pet peeves. That would take way too long. But I have a pet peeve here because you know what it's called. It's Sermon on the Mount. You know what that means? It would be like calling my sermon today Sermon at Whitewater, because that's where it was. It was Jesus' sermon on the mountainside. But my friends, what I believe the sermon really is, it's a sermon of a monarch. It's a king who is speaking to the subjects of his kingdom about what it looks like to to be a part of that kingdom. That's what this is all about. Jesus is describing how we're to be different and distinct from the rest of the world. If we want to be his followers, if we want to be a part of his kingdom that he's invited us into, he's telling us these are the attributes, these are the characteristics that you must have in your life. So my friends, if you're planning on being a part of the kingdom with our King Jesus, then let me tell you, persecution is going to be a part of it. But what exactly did Jesus mean when he talked about persecution? You know, our minds can go a lot of different places in the world we live in today. Was it just something that happened long ago? Was it just something that was physical, torture or torment? Or what all was Jesus really speaking about when he addressed this last beatitude? Well, it can be confusing, and I thoroughly agree. On one hand, obviously, we can't ignore the physical abuse and agony that takes place by strangers that are trying to recant our faith. And that would be a typical traditional view of physical persecution. But I don't think it's just limited to that. I think there's more involved here. But yet, on the other hand, as we're looking at physical persecution, we can't just say that every little spiritual hangnail is something the devil is trying to torment us with and trying to deceive and take away our faith at the same time. So real persecution is cheapened when we bring some inconvenience and some lack of suffering in our lives into it. So we've got to keep true to what persecution really is, but how do we better define it? And I think Jesus does that for us, because you see, in the other Beatitudes, this one sticks out. The other Beatitudes all are covered basically in one verse, very few words. Jesus uses 3 verses to describe persecution here. And I believe he helps us to understand what he's really talking about and how it can affect each of our lives. So like any great teacher, he sees the importance of this by speaking it on it longer than the others. And then in verse 11, he says these things. He goes on to say these things. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Because of me. So we can see that insults, that false accusations, or ridicule, these things are also included in what Jesus is describing here as blessed are you in being persecuted. It's beyond just physical. It's beyond the temporal, but it goes to all sorts of insults and slander. And if you think about Jesus' own ministry, you think about through his own life, the physical harm that he endured happened in the very last night of his life. The 3 years prior to that, he was slandered, he was lied about, he was tormented in so many different ways, but not physically persecuted. And so I think he's opening up our eyes to help us see that persecution is going to come about, and there are multiple forms that it can happen in our lives today. Because in verse 11 there, you see that he doesn't say if people persecute you. He says when. He says when people persecute you. If we are following Jesus Christ, if we want to be like him, then persecution is going to take place in our lives. That's just a part of what it is. But you know, I want to explain right off the bat, again, that we understand what Jesus is saying here. Because I think many times we regard some things of persecution that perhaps aren't. Or maybe we feel like we're being persecuted, but we're really not, because it's really the wrong reasons. Because many times we can become self-righteous or holier than thou. Yes, even us church people. We can become obnoxious. We can become tactless, condemning. This is not the persecution that Jesus is talking about. This is when we do things at our own fault. We make stupid and foolish comments and judgments, and we get some suffering because of it back. We get some negative consequences. That's not what Jesus is talking about here at all. In fact, Peter says in 1 Peter 4:15, if you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or a thief or any kind of criminal or even as a meddler, a person who's in other people's affairs. You shouldn't suffer for these reasons. These are kind of off base. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. When you suffer, when I'm talking about persecution, it's because you're living righteously. You're living differently. You're distinct than the people around you. That's what's going to create persecution in your life, not our own stupid, foolish comments on Facebook. That's not what we're talking about here, even though those can create a lot of pushback and a lot of hurt, perhaps. We need to be careful of what and how we go forward. For Jesus here is pronouncing to his disciples that if you've been persecuted for any reason other than for righteousness and for following me, there really isn't what I'm talking about in this blessing and in this reward that we're going to consider. In fact, Jesus reminds them in John, the 15th chapter, these great words that help us to also be reminded of our relationship with him as opposed to the world that we live in. And he said these words in John 15, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to this world, but I have chosen you out of this world, and that is why the world hates you. Remember the words I spoke to you. No servant is greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also." You see, if we are living a life in Jesus Christ, then we will receive the treatment that he received. Maybe not all the time, and maybe not to some of the extremes. For even as we recall in Jesus' ministry, he had times of popularity, and many people were following him and praising him and thanking him for who he was. But Paul tells us in 2 Timothy, these words he writes, "In fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." So what does this look like? What does it look like for the life that King Jesus has invited us into? What's he calling us to in this invitation of living for him, this righteousness, if you would? And I think we all understand that righteousness is not something that we can earn or been given. It is something that has been a free gift that we receive through Jesus Christ, and that's how we have it. And I believe these Beatitudes kind of help us have a greater understanding of what righteousness is, of how we are to live differently and distinct from this world as we show mercy, as we have peace, as we are pure in heart, as we represent our King in a way that makes others take notice. You see, we have the Spirit of God living within us, empowering us to live a holy life. Right living is not according to some list of do's and don'ts. It's not the old adage that I don't smoke or chew or go with girls who do. It's not going through any of those things. Right living comes from within. It's God empowered through his Spirit that rose Jesus from the dead is the same power that lives in us. And when we allow it to both control and influence our lives, we will live in the way of righteousness that Jesus is talking about here, a way that will bring about his love. I love this statement that talks about righteousness. Righteousness is not forced upon us from the outside, but it flows from within us by that dynamic power of the Spirit of God for the world to see. That's the whole purpose of right living, of being Jesus followers, of being a part of his kingdom here on earth, which is different than the world around us. So as we continue to think through this process, you may wonder, well, who in the world is causing, or where is this persecution going to come from in my life as a Jesus follower, as his disciple? And I don't want to downplay in what I'm about to say the eagerness that the world has to try and hurt those who follow Jesus. It can and it does come from unbelievers many times. But I also know and have experienced different forms of persecution in my own life, as I'm sure you have too. In this definition, people who have slandered or talked about me, co-workers in the past, of course not when I was working at a church, but in other places, neighbors, schoolmates. You've seen it, you've experienced, perhaps you felt it in different ways and in different relationships in your life. And I think we all can understand that in the world we live, there are many countries that purposefully oppose Christianity and openly abuse and kill Christians. And here in our own country, the cultural war against Christianity. And I think we understand that as well, as followers of Jesus who are usually portrayed in a negative light. But even though all of this is true, the bad news that I must break to you today is this: persecution is most frequently an inside job. It's an inside job. We tend to think of persecution as being from perpetrators or strangers from the outside who want to take us down and end us. But most of the time, it's a little closer to home. And I love the explanation of Jesus here. You know, for the last 15 years, I've had the opportunity of leading a team at the Alive Christian Music Festival in Northeast Ohio. I lead a team of people who transport our artists and musicians for the Alive Festival. Here's a shot from about mid-field back down to the stage. But it just happened a few weeks ago. And part of this team for the last 15 years, we've had a lot of different experiences, a lot of different great opportunities to meet a lot of people. We've gone golfing with Toby Mack, gone fishing with David Crowder. You know, you just name it. Our team has had great opportunities to take these guys in different places and do different things. Well, this year, there happened to be a throwback band called Striper. Now, for those of you who are older in the room, you may recall Striper. They were a Christian heavy metal band. Here's what they looked like back in the days, 86, 87. I took my youth group to go see them. And in fact, I had this poster on my wall in my office. And you can just imagine, I had one of my elders, and he was a pretty hip elder at the time. He saw this and he was, whoa, hey, there's some guys, I said, or girls. I said, yeah, that's Striper, and this is what they stand for. You saw the verse there, the theme verse, Isaiah 53, which talks about by his stripes we are healed. Well, it's interesting. They were probably a band that maybe was a little bit ahead of their time for the Christian world, as Amy Grant and Michael W. Smith were the mainliners in that time. They were a little different than them. But yeah, all this music was coming out all sorts of ways, with Christian lyrics at the time. So nonetheless, they had a hard way to go. They really did in a lot of ways. And even though they became number one, they were the first Christian group that ever had a video played on MTV. They were most requested, I think, like multiple weeks in a row for several of their songs on MTV. I mean, they were definitely, I believe, making a difference in our world. But what happened to them along the way was that people, good church people, began to boycott their albums. They began to push back, they began creating rumors, and finally, it was just so much to handle. Actually, in an article that was entitled, Have They Lost Their Stripes?, Robert Sweet, who is a brother of the lead singer, Michael Sweet, shared these words. He said, a lot of Christian people's idea of Striper has become too heavy to carry. And the band obviously decided to take a break. They've just started back this last year with a final battle tour, and that's what they were on when they came to Alive a few weeks ago. But Jesus tells us here, he gives us a clue of where this persecution is coming from. In verse 12, he says, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So it's interesting, who are the they that Jesus is referring to in this verse? I think he gives us great insight as to where we are today. Who is that? Those that persecuted the prophets. Was it the Babylonians? Was it the Ninevites? Maybe the Canaanites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, or some other sites? As many people, and that for legit reasons, that wasn't a people group, the Perizzites. Those are the things that sometimes you get in your body when you're in other places. Nonetheless, it wasn't these people. The Egyptian, the Babylonians, no, those weren't the people that were persecuting the prophets. If we look back and we see it was God's own people who persecuted the prophets. It was their neighbors. It was the members of their families, the people that worshiped the same God, that went to the same temple with them. Jeremiah suffered at the hands of his fellow prophets, his king, and his neighbors. Moses faced more opposition from fellow Israelites than he did from Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Job was tormented by these people who claimed to be his friends. And that the same thing is true for Jesus. Jesus was not taken down. The greatest persecution did not come from Caesar and his people. It came from the Israelites, from God's people. That's who put Jesus to death for a plan. But his persecutions from his own countrymen. his fellow Israelites who were worshiping the same Father. So what I'm saying is this morning, that serious commitment to Jesus and making him king of your life will draw a line in the sand for many people. The thing we call Christianity has been around for over 2,000 years, and it's become quite domesticated, if you would. We've learned how to prune and trim and snip out all the prickly parts so that now we can have a faith without pain. We can have a Christ instead of confronting who just comforts all the time, and he does that, but he also confronts. We have transformation that has been traded for tradition, and that's the way we've always done it. The Beatitudes and the people like you and I who choose to follow them really push aside and stand against the status quo of what Christianity may represent for many people. It causes us as Jesus followers to turn everything and everyone upside down that we come in contact with. That's the Christianity that Jesus is talking about, the righteous living that is going to make people persecute you, insult you, and slander you. And that's why disciples who take Beatitudes seriously should expect to be persecuted. If you get serious about poverty of spirit and confession, then people around you will begin to wonder. If you're determined to submit yourselves in every area of your lives to God's will, then look for other Christians to begin to whisper, fanatic. And if you develop a passion for the holy and pursue it fully, people will be totally confused at what you're doing. And if we try our best with integrity and with passion and peacemaking, it will cause frustrations in those around you. Jesus warns us that if we practice the Beatitudes, we will have persecution. We'll take spiritual steps toward Jesus that he recommends. We will have church members, family members, and friends who will turn their backs on us and walk. You see, the progression is kind of like this. At first, it usually begins with a little ridicule. They'll try to laugh it off. You'll become the brunt of their jokes. And if that fails, then insults will take place. And they'll question your motives and insult your intelligence. And if that isn't enough, the slander will come. And they'll call you fanatical and dangerous. And if you're trying to cover up some terrible and horrible sin in your life, and they'll treat you as an outsider or unappreciated or unwelcome. And then if that is not, you continue pursuit in the kingdom, then they'll continue to destroy you, to cancel you, to put you out of their lives. But my friends, that is what they tried to do to Jesus and his earliest disciples. And so we should feel honored if those things would come upon us as well. Jesus didn't hold anything back when he was going through these Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. He told us exactly how it would be and what to expect if we wanted to follow him and pursue his kingdom in our lives. He told us that we would not have everything as easy as we think. The persecution we would have instead of praise, cruel insults we would get instead of cordial invitations, harassment instead of honor, abuse instead of applause, slander instead of support, and death instead of dignity. I read about this great preacher. Perhaps you've heard of him, John Wesley. 1700s, he was in England, evangelist and preacher, beginning what we know today as Methodism. It was not common for him as he would preach in the 1700s that he would be persecuted. Many times as he was preaching, there are recorded instances of people would throw eggs or bricks or other things at him. So I'm very thankful this morning that you've not come prepared like that. But this was something that was very serious to him. He took it very serious. And one day as he was a circuit rider, if you would, going from one place to another, he was out riding on his horse from one town to another. And as he did, he actually came to mind and said, it has been 3 days since no one has thrown a brick, an egg, or anything at me. And he felt like somehow he had backslidden. He got off his horse. He fell down on his knees and was praying to God, oh God, how have I failed you? How have I backslidden? I've not had any persecution for 3 days. And just so happens, there was this derelict behind a bush that was there and heard him, and he woke him up, and he was so upset that he took a rock near him and threw it over. And as soon as that happened, it went right by his head, and he jumped up and he said, thank God you have not left me. Your presence is still with me. I sometimes wonder, where are the eggs? Where are the bricks? If I'm truly doing the right things that God has called me to in my life. Lots of people who have gone before us have experienced that persecution in many ways throughout their lives. And for us, as Jesus' disciples, we can expect it as well. It will come. And so really the question for us today is, how will we respond? Because you know as well as I do, there's multiple ways to respond. First, we can back off, shut up, go hide away, and that's exactly what our persecutors want. Secondly, we can try and retaliate, repay the pain that they're causing us and pay it back to them. But thirdly, Jesus gives us a prescription of how we should respond. Basically, he says that we should respond with joy and thanksgiving. And I love it because as he talks through this prescription and continues in the verses here in 10, 11, and 12, as he talks about this beatitude, he said, blessed is used twice. My friends, that's a double blessing that is given for this beatitude of being persecuted to those who will take up their cross and follow him, who will live righteously. But not only does he give a double blessing, but secondly, there's a confirmation that we are his children for the kingdom, right where he began in the very beginning. The kingdom of heaven is ours. We've been granted that. I love in verse 12 when he says these words, this is the response, rejoice and be glad because great is your reward in heaven. Rejoice and be glad. If we were to look at the original language, what's really being said there is jump and skip with happy excitement. It's an ongoing thing. It's a verb, it's moving, it's jumping and skipping as you are being persecuted with excitement because we know what is to come for those of us who have committed our lives as disciples of Jesus Christ into his kingdom. Paul says it this way in 1 Corinthians, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him. That's us. That's you and me. That's our eternal destination that God has got for us, who as his disciples pursue a life that Jesus has called us to, which will include persecution. That's what this world needs, disciples who will be poor in spirit, who will mourn, who will be meek, who will hunger after thirst and thirst after righteousness, who will be merciful, pure in heart, peacemakers, as well as those whose very lives will make people take notice and they'll want to push back against it. As we close today, I'm reminded of the Old Testament story of 3 young Hebrew men. I always love saying their names because many times you can confuse them, get them all messed up. But we all may know the story, or at least have heard the story perhaps, of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they teach us a little something when the persecution hits our lives. And so I just want to remind us of their situation and what they did in that time. Because you see, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were completely trusting God for their outcome. And that's how we enter into any persecution, into any fiery time of our lives. It's knowing that God has got our outcome. And I love the words in Daniel 3:17 and 18, when they went to Nebuchadnezzar and they said these things: if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. You see, they understood and they recognized the fiery trials, persecutions would come, and that they, as followers of a true king, would be true alone to that king and follow him. Well, as the story continues, the king in his rage in hearing that ordered that the furnace would be lifted up 7 times hotter than it had ever been. In fact, we read that even the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to throw them into the furnace were killed because of the flames. And as the king is gloating, I'm sure, watching from afar, he looks and he turns to his confidants on either side and he says, did we not bound 3 men and put them into the fire? And they said, well, of course, your majesty. And he said, how come I see 4 men unbound and unharmed walking? And one seems as though they're sons of the gods. And at that, Nebuchadnezzar couldn't handle it. And so we read in verse 26, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace, and he shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. You see, my friends, when you go into the fire with King Jesus, you will see the flames, but you will not be consumed by the heat. You will see the flames, but you won't be consumed by the heat. Because when we're with Jesus, our King, we will not be burned. He has a hope and a future, a place that no eye has seen, no ears heard, no mind could even conceive, a place for every single one of us who choose to follow, to be distinct, to be different, to follow what King Jesus has called us to in his kingdom. So if you're facing a fire today or persecutions in your life, or if not, you will soon, remember these words from Paul, for we may be hard-pressed on every side, but my friends, we are not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. For ours is the kingdom of heaven, both now and forever. God, we thank you for who you are and all that you do for us. The things you've called us into this life sometimes are hard to understand, but we know that no matter what we're going through, you are right there with us. No matter what the situation, no matter the persecution, fire, wherever it is, we trust and thank you for your presence with us. And it's in your name that we pray. Amen.